Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to be looking at a topic that's not terribly complicated, but because it's several events that have happened that are tied together, tends to cause students trouble in terms of trying to keep the information organized. And so we're going to go over the different agricultural revolutions today. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so when we talk about agricultural production, that's going to be Unit 5, Agricultural Geography. And so obviously agriculture is something that is significant in terms of the world that we live in. This is where we get all of our food from. At least a majority of the population of the world, we get our food from a specific type of commercial agricultural practices. And so, obviously, historically, this is important to us. A lot of people have thoughts and feelings about modern agricultural practices, which we'll address to some extent. The goal here is not necessarily to go in depth with each of these, but just kind of give you a broad overview to help you remember some of the significant pieces of each of the different agricultural revolutions. So the first agricultural revolution that we have, it goes by two names. Either you can call it the first agricultural revolution, or you can call it the Neolithic Revolution. If you see either one of those terms, it means the same thing. So what we're talking about when we refer to the Neolithic Revolution is what's happening is it's a transition from a hunter-gatherer based society to an agriculturally based society. So when we talk about the Neolithic Revolution, we're talking about that initial transition from people around the world going from hunters and gatherers, this is the primary way that they produce their food, to agricultural types of food production. Okay, and so that's the initial transition a long time ago. So you'll see the time frame there. I've seen different dates for it, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And so obviously a long time ago, and so it's going to give us our very first human settlements. And when I say settlements, we're talking about permanent human settlements, and that can have a major impact in terms of what's happening within society and the diversification within society in terms of economics and things like that. So there are a lot of impacts that carry over from that, but really we're just worried about this initial transition. So you'll see there, one of the interesting things about the first agricultural revolution is that there's actually a variety of different hearths for that, and so that's something that's pretty unique, and they, as far as they can tell, they happen independently of one another, so they don't necessarily require each other in terms of diffusion. Now you'll see the map there, and it shows you some of the diffusion process from the original hearths to the places around. Some of the hearths that you're going to want to be familiar with are Southwest Asia, because Mesopotamia is generally considered the first place that we have what's called seed agriculture. Now there is what's called vegetative planting, which they believe happened in Southeast Asia earlier, but your teacher will go over the difference between seed agriculture and vegetative planting. Now notice also, it's not just, when we talk about agricultural production, it's not just plants, but it's also going to be animals. So you're talking about the domestication of plants and animals. That term domestication just means to tame them. You're taming them for your own personal use. And in this case, we're talking about not keeping animals for pets, but keeping animals for food production. So that could be meat, that could be milk, and so those are the primary uses for animals in terms of that. So again, the significance, so we'll go back, We'll go back. So you'll see there you have the several independent hearths. The important ones that you want to be familiar with are Southwest Asia. You also want to be familiar with East Asia, and then also South America. And again, you look at the map there and you see kind of the diffusion pattern and process from those hearths to the other places nearby. Also note that each of those places is going to have different plants and animals that are domesticated. That's because they're going to be domesticating plants and animals that are native to their particular region. So that's going to be the initial process there. We already went over one of the impacts, this idea that allows for permanent human settlement and the significance there, especially in terms of the development of cities and things along those lines. And again, that initial transition from a hunter-gatherer based society to an agriculturally based society. So that's the first agricultural revolution, the Neolithic Revolution. So we'll move on to the second agricultural revolution. You'll notice this doesn't happen until about the 1750s. So for the most part, essentially, agriculture stays very similar from that first revolution 10 to 12,000 years ago up until 1750. So it's a really long time until we get another breakthrough. When we talk about this particular revolution, notice how it's happening around the same time as the Industrial Revolution, because what's happening is during that Industrial Revolution period, in terms of there's new developments in terms of a scientific outlook on life, because you're not far after the scientific revolution. are kind of right in the midst of the scientific revolution. It's all kind of happening very close to one another. So you've got a kind of a new way of looking at the world. Economics is changing, so the energy processes are changing. So there's a lot of changes that are taking place, and so that's all going to play a part in the development of the second agricultural revolution. So you see the definition there. It's really more of a move towards more scientific, mechanized, and more specialized agricultural practices. So this is really when we're going to start to see the workforce divvy up in terms of farmers producing specific types of crops and animals, and not necessarily producing a variety of crops and animals. So you notice it starts there in Europe. Different processes start in different places. So one of the first processes in terms of selective breeding is going to start in Denmark, and then also you're going to have more of the mechanized elements of agriculture begin in England, because that's where the first steam engines are going to be developed. But you also have the enclosure movement that happens there. That's going to be significant to agriculture as well. And so you'll see there some of the elements of it. So it's the development of larger commercial farms dedicated to the production of one crop or animal. For the most part, there are farms that might produce multiples. You might have fields that produce one crop, and then another field produces another. That's all based on one particular farmer. But for the most part, the idea is the farmers are moving towards specialization of a particular crop or animal. So you do have the process of selective breeding, which has happened for a long time, but hasn't necessarily been widely applied. So selective breeding of plants and animals to get the particular quality that you're looking for out of that product. Because of the more scientific approach, the idea of chemicals and the use of chemicals is going to become more important. The understanding of the chemical processes in agriculture, so what specific elements are important to the production of crops. Now, they had done some trial and error stuff, and they realized that things like manure help out with plants and help production of plants, but they didn't necessarily know why. And so they're going to figure out that nitrogen is really important, and so that's one of the reasons why bat guano becomes so significant in agricultural production, and that actually is a highly sought after good for a period of time there. Here are some other techniques, and there are others, but these are just kind of the more significant ones. Is you have improvement in crop storage, understanding how to store crops more properly so that the food lasts longer and so that it doesn't spoil as quickly. Improvement in field drainage, and this is going to be really important for a place like the Netherlands. I guess I have Denmark there, don't I? Should be the Netherlands. Anyway, sorry, the Netherlands. So that's going to be important low-lying regions like the Netherlands and also in England, and so it's going to allow them to reclaim more farmland in their countries. Improve elements or methods of irrigation, so to move water from places into the field so that you can cultivate your crops, and then also the development of crop rotation. Up to this point, most farmers had used field rotation, and so the idea of the three-field system, where you planted two fields, let the third field fallow so it could regenerate its nutrients and the viability of the soil. Crop rotation is using that understanding of chemical processes in agriculture and using certain crops to add the nutrients to the soil. And so you have the rotation of those crops. So you plant certain crops in the fall or spring, and then you would do cover crops in the fall/winter. And so a lot of those low-lying crops, beans aren't really a low-lying crop, but you have various lettuces, kind of like cabbage and things that will help to revitalize the soil. Beans add nitrogen to the soil, whereas more corn and wheat are extracting nitrogen from the soil, and so that helps in terms of maintaining the viability of soil for a longer period of time. And you're able to get crops, you're able to get produce year-round as opposed to just during one particular time of the year. In terms of the impact of the second agricultural revolution, so this is specific to England is what's called the enclosure movement. What's going to happen is England is actually going to pass laws, and as a result of that, large landowners are going to be kicking smaller landowners or sharecroppers. You don't have sharecroppers, but tenant farmers off of their farms, and so what they're doing is they're consolidating the farms to make them more efficient. They're trying to make more money off of the farms that they run. And so they're going to make that money not by renting out their land, but by selling the crops that they grow. And so through the enclosure, actually, you have this consolidation of the land, getting rid of the small divided farms, and so that your farming can become more efficient, and so that you can grow more, you can raise more, you can do it more efficiently. The other thing that allows the farmers to do is allows them to experiment, because if they fail, at least their farm is large enough where they can kind of recoup those losses. If I'm a farmer and I'm a subsistence farmer, then if I fail, then I can't feed my family. If I'm a commercial farmer and I have kind of diversity of crops and animals that I may be planting, or I plant primarily corn or wheat, or I'm raising primarily cows, but one section of my farm I'm kind of trying things out, then my whole operation isn't going to go under. So it does allow for more experimentation. But obviously it's going to negatively impact the small farmers, small farmers, not small in stature, but small in terms of land ownership. So they're not going to have the farms to live off of anymore to make their money. And so they end up having to move to the cities. Now, again, this is working in conjunction with the Industrial Revolution. So they move into the cities, and at the same time, essentially, factories are beginning to open up. And they move into those factories and get those factory jobs. And then that's kind of the transition of the Industrial Revolution and all the impacts in terms of migration, and then the cultural impacts of the kind of explosion. Explosion of cities, the infrastructural impacts, things along those lines. So that's the third point there. It brings the urbanization movement. One of the important things, or one of the good things, is that we now have a production system that actually allows for the support of larger populations. And so that obviously is important. You have this Thomas Malthus talking about the inability to support the population. They're becoming more efficient, so they don't need as much land to produce the same amount of food. So that's going to be a positive impact there. And again, it is kind of the beginning of our modern industrial agricultural production system. And so when we talk about the methods we use today, it really kind of gets its start back during this particular time period, for better or for worse. So the third revolution we're going to look at is what's called the Green Revolution. And so when we talk about, and some people divide this up into two different segments, and so that's what I'm going to do. But the first one is the Green Revolution. And when we're talking specifically about the Green Revolution, it specifically begins when we start looking at the development of hybrid seed technology in order to produce improved varieties of plants. And of course, that can transition over to animals as well, but specifically with the Green Revolution, it's looking at plants. Now, in the Green Revolution, there are three specific crops that are focused on, and that's rice, maize, and wheat. And the reason for that is because those are significant cereal grains for a large percentage of the population. Now, specifically within the Green Revolution, the idea is that they're trying to develop improved seed technology to help poorer countries so that they then could feed their populations. So they're looking at improvements in the strains, specifically things like trying to create drought-resistant seeds. Hold on just a second. So trying to create drought-resistant seeds, or seeds that maybe or plants that don't necessarily need as much water, so that those could be grown specifically in drier climates. So the idea is that these less wealthy countries wouldn't have to rely on wealthier countries to feed the populations of those countries. They would be able to support themselves, and they wouldn't have to import the food. And obviously, providing for the populations of the country so that people have the sufficient food in order to survive and get by and improve their standard of living. The person you need to know is Norman Borlaug. He works within the United States, and he's really the one that kind of pushes this effort forward. So again, you look at the reason for that, and that it's primarily going to impact Mexico and India. And that's actually one of the criticisms, is that it doesn't do enough to help the continent of Africa, but does see improvements in Mexico and India in their food production. And so you see the impact there. The less wealthy countries actually are able to improve their cereal grain output. And I have some stats on it, but I forgot what they are off the top of my head. Not important for us right now in terms of review. So the criticism of it is that even though you're talking about trying to create greater independence, some people say it actually creates greater dependency on wealthier countries, because the wealthier countries own those seed varieties, and so you have to get the seed varieties from them, okay? Or you need the capital in order to have a larger farm to follow kind of the industrial commercial agricultural production system that wealthier countries do. You also need the fertilizers from the wealthier countries, things like that. And as a result of this, just like with the enclosure movements, potentially and essentially, it forces out smaller farmers because they can't afford to purchase these seed varieties, and therefore they're not as competitive, things along those lines. And if you're expanding the farms, then you're actually utilizing more natural resources. So whether we're talking about water for farms, you're talking about fuel for machines, and of course, if you're using chemical fertilizers, that's not really natural resource, but the potential for pollution and runoff and those types of things. So those are some of the criticisms that people have of it. And of course, those who are advocates of it say, look, sure, so there might be some problems here, but what we've done is we've helped to improve the lives of the people in some of these less wealthy countries. More people have more food to eat. That's a positive thing, right? Certainly. And then what you're going to do is you're going to end up making the economy more efficient because if smaller farmers were inefficient in their production, they're going to be forced to go find something else to do and hopefully create greater efficiencies in their economy. And so those would be arguments for those who advocate for something for the benefits of the Green Revolution. Then you move into the Bio-Revolution, and this is what some people actually lump together, the Green Revolution and the Bio-Revolution. I divide it up because I see it as two different processes. I don't know if that's technically correct, but that's what I do. So within the Bio-Revolution, this is the way I distinguish it. This is modern stuff. The Green Revolution is 1950s. Bio-Revolution is more modern. So basically what we're doing is we're using the ability to manipulate genetics to bring about different seed varieties. So Green Revolution is all about crossbreeding. So you breed the plants with the particular traits that you're looking for, bringing those together, and you kind of breed them through a natural process. The Bio-Revolution is more of genetic manipulation. So you take out pieces of genes of one plant or one variety, you insert it into another, and so that's what's going to give you the new strain. So the idea is similar, the processes are different. And there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on out there. Article came out several years ago. They're talking about tearless onions, and what they've done is they've gone in and pulled out the strain of sulfur from onions, and so that people can cut onions without crying. I don't know that is super important for the world that we live in, but it's a first world problem, right? That you cry when you cut onions. But it's an example of what's happening with this Bio-Revolution. Okay, so the development of this genetic modification, so GMOs, that a lot of people are worried about. It is a part of our modern agricultural system. It's the use of genetic manipulation to create more efficient agricultural technologies. So that's really the whole idea, is we're trying to become more efficient. Whether or not that's good or bad in terms of the process, that's not really that becomes part of the discussion, but that's not really important in terms of what it is that we're trying to do. And we have become more efficient, which generally you would see as a positive thing, but again, there are those who feel like some of the things that come out of it are not positive enough to continue on with the practice. So again, the impact really is just more efficient agricultural production. You can actually go, and there's some pretty good TED Talks and things that talk about different rice varieties that are used in different parts of Asia that have helped to deal with certain vitamin deficiencies that the people there have, and so that's pretty interesting. But anyway, so some of the criticisms, the idea that it makes agricultural production too expensive because you're having to purchase these genetically modified crops, and so again, same argument as last time. Poor farmers can't afford it. So they're forced out of the business. You can only have large landholders and large-scale farmers and commercial farms participate, and so you have fewer people working in that field of the economy. Okay, so again, large companies are going to monopolize agricultural markets, and you also have large companies, Western countries, that patent seed varieties, and so they own the actual variety of the seed. And so then it ends up being legal issues and things like that, especially if there's cross-pollination that's happened in the United States. A lot of people don't like Monsanto, and the reason for that is they'll actually sue farmers if there's some accidental cross-pollination, and so you can look at that. It's not really our purposes today. Some people are really concerned about less genetic variety, the idea of monocultures because of potential impact on the food supply, because what could happen is if you have just one variety of a crop or an animal, and some illness gets into that, some disease or bacteria, then it could affect the entire population. And so that's why some people encourage the use of polyculture, so that if one particular plant doesn't make it that year, then you have things to fall back on, things like that. So that's something that people are concerned about. The other concern is that we really don't understand what the long-term health impact of GMOs is going to be. We haven't been able to test it because it hasn't really been around long enough. Some people look at some of the modern health issues that we have today and say that that's the result. As far as I know, they haven't done a whole lot of testing on it, and so it's still kind of out. So it's one of these things. It's interesting and it's neat, but then potentially it could be harmful to our health, but we just don't know necessarily what that is. So there's some concerns that people have. Those who are advocates of it, again, it makes agriculture production more efficient, which means that our economies are more efficient. We're able to do more on less land. We're able to feed more people, which generally considered as a good thing. It makes agricultural production more precise, and so the idea there would be you actually need less water, you actually need less pesticides and fertilizers because you can be more targeted with your use of those things, so that can become more efficient as well. And then also, if you look at where you can plant certain crops or where you can raise certain animals, it gives us greater variety because we can actually create plants and animals that withstand some of the challenges of either drier climates or colder climates. So what that allows for more people around the world to grow a greater variety of food, potentially. And so those would be the folks who are advocates of that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so those are for me, the 4 different agricultural revolutions. So hopefully that was helpful to you. Hopefully that made some sense. Thanks for watching, and as always, I hope to see you next time.